Alrighty, hello ladies and welcome to our first video for Unit 4. Unit 4 is all about evolution. So before we dive into the actual parts of this unit, the evolution, all those different things, there are some really important terms that you need to know going into this unit. The first of those important terms is heredity. If you remember, heredity is one of the properties of life. So heredity is how characteristics are passed on to offspring. So think about how your mom and your dad, they created you. You are half your mom, half your dad. All of your characteristics were passed on to, all of their characteristics, I should say, were passed on to you. And this happens for things that reproduce asexually as well. They're still passing on their genetics and their characteristics to their offspring. So the next term I want you to know is gene. Genes are functional units of heredity. Genes are found in your DNA. I'm going to draw a little DNA strand. And really quickly, let's just go ahead and define what this means. Functional units. Functional means like working part. So it's the part that is working in your genetics. Sorry, that looks kind of weird. Okay, the next word is trait, and traits are observed characteristics. So think about things like your eye color or your hair color. All of these are types of observed characteristics. The next word is adaptation, and that is a feature that is common in a population because it provides some improved function. That definition is kind of strange. So what it means is that species in a population need to adapt to be better able to survive, reproduce, and pass on their traits. So species might adapt to their particular environment for the most success that they can survive, reproduce, and pass on their traits. Let's move over to this box. Now, I'm hoping that you've heard these words before, but if you haven't, I'm going to go ahead and just define them really quickly for you. So the first word is alleles. Alleles are alternate forms of genes for a given trait. So essentially, these genes can be broken down into different alleles. Those alleles can be dominant or recessive. So think about your eye color. Brown eyes are dominant over blue eyes. So this specific trait, your eye color, has alternate forms. It can be presented in different ways. Brown eyes are what we call dominant over blue eyes, which would be recessive. Dominant alleles mask the effect of other alleles. So brown eyes, if one of your parents has brown eyes, that allele is going to be passed on to you, and you will most likely have brown eyes. That is a dominant trait. If your mom has brown eyes and your dad has blue eyes, odds are you will probably have brown eyes because that is a dominant allele to that particular trait. The opposite of dominant would be recessive. Recessive is an allele that is masked by the dominant trait. So brown eyes, blue eyes. So if both of your parents have blue eyes, odds are that you also have blue eyes. We would call, if you have two identical alleles for a trait, homozygous. So something that's homozygous would be an organism with two identical alleles for a trait. If both your parents have brown eyes, that would also be homozygous. So you would also have two identical alleles for that trait. You would have brown eyes. Heterozygous, then, is an organism with two different alleles. So maybe your mom has brown eyes, your dad has blue eyes. That means that you are going to be heterozygous because you're going to have one dominant trait and one recessive trait. Your mom has brown eyes, your dad has blue eyes, or whichever way I said it, I can't remember. But you would have two different alleles for that particular trait, which would be eye color. That is the important terms for this unit that you should have a little bit of background on. We're going to go ahead and move into the actual parts of this unit. The first thing that I want us to define is evolution. And specifically, we are talking about microevolution. So microevolution is the change in the frequency of a trait in a population over time. And when we say over time, we mean a long time. This is not going to happen overnight. So one of the major parts about evolution is what we call natural selection. Natural selection is the process by which organisms are better adapted to their environment. And those organisms that are better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring, which then means that they are able to pass on their traits. The theory of natural selection was first really explained by this guy named Charles Darwin and is now believed to be the main process that brings about evolution. So let's get into some of the things that happen when we're talking about evolution. The first is that if there's no variation, and I'm going to just go ahead and put over here in the traits within a population, then the population will not change. So if every single, let's just say animal in a population has the exact same traits, then the population is not going to change, right? Everything that's going to get passed on to the offspring is going to be pretty much the same. If there is a variation in a trait and there is an environmental selective pressure, so that means things that are going to affect the possible traits that we're talking about. So maybe it's the specific color of the environment or the weather in that environment, the food, all these different things. Those are all environmental selective pressures that interact with that particular trait that we're talking about. Then the frequency or how often that trait is around is going to change over time. I don't like this word variance. Let's change that. So trait variations kind of means the same thing, but it's a little bit easier to understand. So if there is a variation in a trait and an environmental selective pressure that interacts with that trait, then the frequency of the trait variations is going to change in the population over time. That variant or trait variation that contributes to the survival will increase in the population and the other trait will decrease. So let's come up with an example here. Let's talk about bunnies. Okay, so in the winter, maybe we have brown and white bunnies. In the winter, the white bunnies are going to better be able to survive because they can blend into the snow and predators might not see them. So there's going to be an increase in the number of white bunnies and a decrease in the number of brown bunnies because the brown bunnies are going to be hunted and easier to find from the predators. So that's kind of the best example that I can give you. So then maybe in the summertime, the white bunnies are going to be easier to find and are going to be selected against compared to the brown bunnies that maybe can blend in with the dirt or the leaves, different things like that. So there can be an increase and decrease in the chances that each type of bunny can survive based on the environment. These organisms that obtain sufficient energy are better able to reproduce. So if the brown bunnies are constantly running from predators, they are going to be more tired, less able to spend energy reproducing, and because all of their energy is going into running from predators. Whereas the white bunnies in the winter are able to obtain enough energy because they're blending into their environment, they're not being hunted against, that they will be able to reproduce. Now, in order for that variation to be passed on, it must be inherited. So it has to be a trait that can be passed down. It cannot be an acquired trait. So let's go ahead and move on to the next page of this. Natural selection, and this is important, acts on individuals. Think about our bunnies. The weather is going to act on each individual bunny, and it's going to select the individuals that are most fit in that particular environment to survive and reproduce. Maybe you've heard this before, but natural selection is essentially survival of the fittest. The most fit for that environment will be the most likely to survive and pass on their traits. Now, evolution acts on populations. So natural selection acts on individuals. Evolution acts on populations. And this takes a long time to happen. Okay, so a gene pool consists of all the alleles or variation for a trait in all of the individuals that make up a population. So all of our bunnies, regardless of if they are brown or white, those all make up the gene pool, all of their alleles together. Now, population genetics is the study of the gene and allele frequencies in a population. So people literally study how often different alleles are present in different environments and try to predict how different environments are going to respond to different environmental changes. So, how we're going to talk about evolution in this class in natural selection is through what we call storyboards. And there are a few rules for drawing storyboards. The first rule is to keep it simple. So, if we wanted to draw our population of bunnies, maybe we would have green represent brown bunnies, non-filled in will represent white bunnies. We would draw it, I'm sorry if you hear my cat meowing. We would draw it like this maybe. So this would show us just a snapshot of how many of each different type of gene and allele is expressed in a population. So use simple shapes. You could use circles or triangles, squares. Just keep it simple. Don't draw anything crazy. You should show the different traits. So make some way that you can separate the traits. So maybe you shade them in, maybe you do some type of pattern within them, but you should have a way to figure out which ones represent which trait. The last thing is you don't need a large amount of these inside of a box. So just do small amounts of the shapes. You don't need to draw 50 circles. So small amounts of your shapes that you're drawing. So in my storyboard right here, we have the fact that there are more brown bunnies than white bunnies. That's kind of how we would talk about this storyboard. So in genetic terms, microevolution, I'm going to use a different color, maybe a darker green. Microevolution is any change in the relative frequency of alleles or traits in the gene pool of a population over time. So we're kind of just showing a snapshot of the frequency of the different alleles in a population. So let's go ahead and do a little example of kind of how storyboards would work and how we would look at them through graphs. First, let's talk about this part down here. So evolutionary change in the frequency of alleles can be shown in storyboards, which would be our boxes, or as a graph of allele frequency versus time. And I'm going to show you how we would do this. So let's do the storyboards first. We'll go ahead and use kind of the same example. So I'll put it down here. A shaded in circle is going to represent our brown bunnies, and a non-shaded in circle will represent our white bunnies. So in our first generation, there are more brown bunnies than white bunnies. So we'll represent that by drawing more filled in circles than non-filled in circles. How we would maybe graph that would be number of our population. Down here, we would put, it's technically over time, but we're also going to put down here our traits. So white bunnies and brown bunnies. And to graph this, we would start off with not very many white bunnies, and we would be showing that there are more brown bunnies in our population. So now let's try to draw what would happen at 100 generations. So maybe our population that we're talking about, it's becoming more and more frequent that the amount of snow and how often it's snowing. So at 100 generations, we could expect less brown bunnies and more white bunnies because of the snow. White bunnies are able to hide from the predators. They are able to become more, I don't want to say, how do I want to say it? They are able to reproduce more often than the brown bunnies because they aren't running from predators all the time. So at 100 generations, we now have more white bunnies than brown bunnies. At 500 generations, if it's still snowing more and more often, and a generation, I should make this clear, is two parents. Think about your parents. So maybe your fourth generation of your family. Your parents had you, or let's go back even further. Your great grandparents had your grandparents had your parents had you. That would be 4 generations. So here we're showing 100 generations, 500 generations. Lots of passing on of genes over time. At 500 generations, we're saying that it's still snowing. There's a lot of snow. We would predict that there would now be even more white bunnies and even less brown bunnies. So if we were to graph this again, we would expect the number of white bunnies to brown bunnies. We're going to start off pretty high for white bunnies, and there will be less and less brown bunnies over time. So that's kind of the rundown, and we'll practice with this in class if this is confusing to you. But this is just kind of how we will represent population changes with allele frequencies, either as storyboards or as graphs. Let me go ahead and end the video. And as always, we're going to practice this in class. If you have any questions, we will definitely be going over it together so that you get enough practice to do well on the quiz and understand the concepts.